Good afternoon and welcome to the Healthcare Business Intelligence webinar series. This is our third installment, and today we're going to be talking about technology and architecture. I am Laura Madsen. My title is BI Evangelist and Healthcare Services Lead here at Lancet. And just as we're getting started here, just so you know, as you're looking at your screen, you have a little navigation panel there. And if you have any questions, as we go throughout the webinar, please feel free to go ahead and enter those in. And there's a little spot there where you can type in a question. And we'll be taking those throughout the webinar, and then we'll be collecting those, and then I'll answer any questions that we might get at the end. All right. So the agenda for today, technology and architecture is it is very near and dear to my heart. The great thing, the very interesting thing about technology and architecture is that it is one of the easiest things to solve. And we'll talk about why that's true as we go through today. But there are a lot of activities that are associated with business intelligence, whether it's healthcare or not, that are a little bit more complex to solve for, right? It's the governance issues, the data quality issues, or all of these other things. And the great thing about living in 2013 and doing business intelligence in 2013 is I'm no longer dealing with the technology barriers that I dealt with 15 years ago. Healthcare data is still complex, and there's still a lot of opportunities, but for the most part, if you're really mindful about how you approach these questions and concerns and issues, we can work through most of them. And so what we're going to talk about today from a technology and architecture perspective is really the approach, how you do that work. I'm not going to get in to tell you how to actually create a data model for a payer or a provider or anything like that. We're going to talk about approach and methodologies and what's best practice as you move forward. So today our agenda is talking about what is the scope of technology and architecture, and I think that's very important. We use the word architecture a lot in business intelligence. It can mean many, many different things. So we want to be more specific, more finite about what architecture means for our time together this afternoon. And then technology, we're going to talk a little bit about what technology is, but if you think about it this way, it really is the software and the hardware that we use to build up our healthcare business intelligence programs. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why this is important. That seems like a rather obvious statement. Of course it's important. But because there are so many different ways to approach architecture, we want to talk about why each of those different ways of thinking about it is important, why you can't just ignore one aspect of architecture versus the other. And then finally, again, talking about methods or how you approach it. What's a good way to make business decisions in terms of technology and architecture? And I think that's very important, because one of the keys to a great business intelligence program is having your business very involved in the activity. And when we start talking about architecture, you often see that glazed over look on business folks' eyes. We don't want that, right? We want them to be informed and participatory and help us make really good business decisions. And there's ways to do that. So we'll talk through that. So let's first talk about architecture. And in terms of business intelligence, what architecture we're going to address today. So there's really, if you want to think about architecture, there's all kinds of different architecture, right? There's data architecture, there's information architecture, there's enterprise integration architecture. There's all kinds of different architecture. You Google that, and you could go on for days and days. And as a matter of fact, in my book Healthcare Business Intelligence, the chapter on technology and architecture goes into each of those in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to do all of that today. What we're going to really focus on today in terms of business intelligence is around the ETL and the data. I'm not going to cover infrastructure at all today. So we're going to talk about ETL, or extract, transform, and load, and data architecture. So I'm sure that each of you have heard the analogy in your business intelligence career about architecture being like a blueprint. And for the most part, when I talk to people outside of business intelligence or executives that are new to business intelligence, I do talk about it in terms of building a house, right? We need a blueprint for how you approach this, what I term the healthcare information environment, because it's not just one thing, right? It's a series of things. And I think this is important to be very planful about how you approach the data in your information environment. There have been many scenarios that I've seen personally where as I start to work with a new client, I look at their data, I look at their data structures, their architecture, and I will often see what I like to call the hallway to nowhere. And it's sort of a nod to the analogy about the blueprint or building, using the analogy of building a house when we're talking about data warehouses. And what I will see is if somebody's built a data architecture for a healthcare business or for a healthcare organization, but didn't really have a lot of either business participation or didn't have a lot of experience in healthcare, they often get tripped up. So one of the complicating scenarios associated with healthcare data is that we have numerous amounts of many-to-many relationships. And you generally don't see that in other industries. So what we'll sometimes see is that as they're trying to create all of these joins or interrelationships in these models, they end up building sort of a hallway to nowhere. So you always have to hit some table in order to get member month or something like that. I remember a couple of years ago I was working with a client and we took a look at their data model and took a look at all their queries, and we found out that they had 13 joins every time they wanted to find out the count of a member, and their queries were just taking forever. That to me is building a hallway to nowhere. And you don't have to do that. There's no reason to be in that situation. Because we really have an opportunity now to not only learn from other industries from an architecture perspective, but really think about and take advantage of the best practices associated with good data architecture and apply those to healthcare so that we avoid some of those easily avoidable pitfalls like the hallway to nowhere. So one of the things that I want to encourage you to do, whether you're a business leader or in IT, is to think about being very planful about your healthcare information environment and understand that there's a lot of work that has to happen to architect that appropriately, and you want to make sure that you don't just skip over that step because the question of course would be, would you build a brand new house without a blueprint? Would you just hire a contractor and say, hey, I got this chunk of land over here, build me a 3-bedroom, 3-bathroom house? And I don't think that any of you would say, sure, why not? Because you really need to know, there's a foundation, there's this much square feet. I want the kitchen to be facing the east. I want my bedroom to be on the north side where it's nice and dark. There's always those kinds of relationships in a blueprint and obviously in a data warehouse. So if your answer is no, then you should never think about building a data warehouse without some level of architecture or nod to architecture. So the question is this really important, right? Thinking about architecture often can overwhelm people, especially if you've never done it before. I've had plenty of conversations with data architects in the past, and they're just like, oh, I don't even want to touch healthcare data. It's so messy. And so I find a lot of times my clients will just sort of put together data structures and relate them, and it works well enough, and they sort of create some data marts and some views, and they go along quite well until they're not going along quite well. And that often impedes their ability to use the system or those things that we talk about from a data warehousing perspective, right? The scalability, extendability, reliability, all of those things, which we'll talk about a little bit more. So when a business executive says, I don't know that I really want to do this data architecture thing. It seems like it's a lot of work. I'm not really understanding the value that comes out of it. I tell them this, unfortunately, very true story, and it is a cautionary tale when we think about an industry like healthcare and how much scrutiny we're under from a data perspective. So this was a number of years ago. In the early 2000s, I was working at a payer organization, and they had created a new product, and it was very much a new product, but we had a lot of the bones associated with being able to deliver the product from a client's perspective. So in other words, we had nurses on telephones. And so they sold this new product. And one of the key aspects of this new product was reporting to the Food and Drug Administration around something called adverse events. So somebody would call us and say, I just took my medication and I can't feel my left arm. That would be considered an adverse event, and it was our responsibility to report that back to the FDA. So from a reporting analytics group, we went back to our executives and said, we're happy to do this. You just got to give us, a couple months to architect this appropriately. And they said, well, we don't have a couple months. We already sold this product, and we're gonna go live in a couple of weeks. So we quickly scrambled together and tried to, what I lovingly refer to as, bastardize the data in order to be able to report on these adverse event activities. And one Tuesday evening, it was real late, maybe 11 o'clock, I get a phone call, and it was the business analyst that was responsible for running these reports, and she just said to me, I missed a join. And for those of you that are in the data world, you probably understand what that means. But essentially, when she wrote the query, because it was so convoluted, because we didn't have time to make modifications to the architecture, she missed a join. And what ended up happening as a result of that is we failed to report a number of adverse events to the Food and Drug Administration on behalf of our client. And after a number of very stressful days, full days, working diligently trying to figure out how big the gap was, I was called into an office with a attorney, and I spent the next 3 or 4 weeks marking all of my documentation with attorney-client privilege and being interviewed by our corporate risk attorneys. And all of this can be directly attributed to our inability to stop long enough to appropriately architect data to ensure that we controlled the risk that we were at for reporting the thing that we were responsible for. And I can promise you that over the years as I've been a consultant, I've seen a number of instances where the architecture did not support the ability to easily report things that are our responsibility to report. And that's not okay when it's something that's so easy to address, right? So let's talk about, when I talk about a healthcare information environment, let's talk about what that really means so that we can get our arms around where we apply the architecture for these activities. So this is a sort of a very standard way to think about information architecture. As a matter of fact, some of you may recognize it. It's adapted from the Corporate Information Factory book that was written in 1999. And when I show this, it's really meant to be a communication tool to business folks, right? This is not something that a DBA or a true data architect could take and do something with, right? It's just a schematic to explain to business executives how data flows from one spot to the next. And it's very powerful because what you notice here is it's not quite literally somebody sitting at their computer grabbing data out of a system. There are steps, and many steps, and every time you take a step with data, you have to make sure that you're not sort of violating some best practice or messing stuff up, right? And that has a lot to do with not only the data architecture, so where you land that data, but also the ETL architecture. So how you take that data out of the source system, apply those business rules, and then land it in the data warehouse. So as we look at this healthcare information environment, on the very left side, you see your data sources. And these are the transactional systems. If you're a payer, it's a claims adjudication system. If you're a provider, it's an EHR. What you'll notice is that they can be databases, they can be cubes, or they can be flat files like Excel or views off of another table. The source of the data doesn't necessarily matter. What we want to do, though, in these terms is best practice is to get those sources out of those transactional systems, not only to buffer the transactional systems themselves from a performance perspective, but also to give us in the data warehousing team the ability to control the data, right? So as soon as it's out of those transactional systems, the control, at least from a performance and data quality perspective, becomes ours. Prior to that, while it's still in the transactional system, in those applications, the performance and the all the other sort of things that are associated with that still reside with the business layer that is related to those databases. So in other words, the EHR is still in the clinician's hands, right? So from a data warehousing perspective, in order to report on that data appropriately and control the good quality, we have to get it out of those systems so that we can have that opportunity to do that. The first spot we put it is into an ODS, or an operational data store. This is also often referred to as a staging area. Not a lot happens to the data there. It's just a spot to stop, so that we can, again, have this opportunity to apply these business rules within the data. And those business rules vary a lot. We can talk about things like how you identify a member or a unique member, to the number of claims, the number of patients, the number of bed days, all of those things. But you have to be able to apply these standard business rules. And you have data quality steps in each of these places, right? So as you take data out of the source systems and you land it into your ODS, you should be doing, if nothing else, a record count to make sure you didn't miss anything. As you apply the business rules between the operational data store or the staging area into your foundational area, which is your enterprise data warehouse, you should be applying all those business rules and then taking those data quality steps to make sure that those business rules are doing exactly what you think they should be doing to the data. That was the webinar we talked about, I believe the very first webinar on data quality. So right here is where you see that architecture comes into play. We have both ETL architecture and enterprise data warehouse, or data warehousing architecture. And those two areas have to play very closely together, right? We think about architecture almost always in terms of the data warehouse or data architecture. So that blueprint, what does the data look like? A series of tables, all the many-to-many relationships. The chicken feet that we often refer to when we're looking at either logical or conceptual data models. And that's all very true, but I also believe that ETL architecture is equally important as the data architecture itself, because our ability to get that data out, apply all of these, let's be honest, right, relatively convoluted business rules when we're talking about healthcare, and then landing that appropriately, and not only doing that in a reasonable amount of time with a frequency that meets our business users' needs. This ETL layer of healthcare, this healthcare information environment, is becoming more and more important for us as we create these very complex healthcare information environments. So both of these layers from an architectural perspective are critical, both ETL architecture and data warehousing architecture. In that foundation, you'll also note that we have an analytics sandbox. I like these. They're very popular in the BI industry. It's just a spot where your analysts go. They're buffered from the EDW, which is really responsible for that self-service reporting out to your average business user. But most analysts and most organizations aren't average business users, right? They know that data really well. They don't necessarily want some pretty front-end tool. They need to get in there and answer a very specific business question. And they're savvy enough to be able to control that analytics sandbox themselves. So those are really great spots. And the usage between the enterprise data warehouse, or the data that goes into the enterprise data warehouse, how you use that data versus how you use the analytics sandbox, is fundamentally different. So separating those two things out makes an awful lot of sense. Then of course we have our data mart layer. And our data mart layer is a logical grouping of data that's pretty standard data warehousing sort of best practice. If you have a series of reports that you're always hitting, create a data mart, right? And allow that performance to be as optimized of an experience as possible. So, as we're looking at providers, it's a physician panel. As we're looking at payers, it's those cost and utilization reports. just make sure that when you're doing that, you structure your data warehouse architecture appropriately to allow for the hierarchy to drill all the way past that data mart and into the most granular level of data into the data warehouse, rather than getting stopped at that data mart and then your business user's like, well, this is great, but I can't drill all the way down to my data warehouse. You don't have to do that first phase, but you have to make sure that that flow between those logical data marts into your EDW exists long-term from a self-service perspective. And then finally, your business intelligence presentation layer, and this is the products that we all know and love, the business objects, MicroStrategies of the world. And now, of course, we not only use them on our laptops and our PCs, but it's a very mobile-driven industry now. And just, so you're aware, it's very rare that a company has just one business intelligence tool, because it's often a situation where it doesn't meet everybody's needs. Just like we have an analytics sandbox, because those needs are fundamentally different. I will often find scenarios where it doesn't make sense to have just one tool, because there's a deep set of analysts that really need a very analytic focused tool. So you will often see that you'll have more than one BI presentation layer product in there, and that's just something that you're going to have to manage as you go forward. There's also obviously architecture associated with a lot of those. Many of those products have sort of preferences, if you will, and so as you're going through and you're thinking about architecting for your healthcare information environment, you need to be mindful of those and make sure that you optimize your architecture for those presentation layer products or your traditional BI layer products. And then at the bottom is an audit control environment. This is very specific to healthcare, but it's one of those things that we all recognize as something that we have to live through. Can't tell you how many audits I've lived through personally. And the one thing that and at least in my experience, every time an auditor came, even when I knew they were coming, it was always a scenario where my whole week was shot while that auditor was on site, because I was running around trying to figure out how to get them the data that they were asking for. And, the data that they're asking for shouldn't be a surprise to any of us, but the way that we've structured a lot of our healthcare information environments, the structures were meant to report on the stuff that our business users are interested in, not necessarily the auditors. So this audit control environment is a separate area. It's very controlled from a security perspective. Nobody really has access to it except your administrator on the IT side. And it includes, if you have a source safe or a product where you keep all your code, that's great. But this would be sort of a complementary thing to that. If you don't have a source safe, then you put all your code in here and you put the data itself in there, because you keep your ODS data only for a day or a week or however often you refresh. But in an audit control environment, they see that data pre the EDW so that they know how you applied those business rules. And those are often the scenarios that the auditors are interested in, is what business rules have you applied that modify the data in any way. So it's a very nice thing to have as far as just an ease of use from an audit perspective. Your auditor comes on site, you give them credentials to the audit control environment, and they can do what they need to do rather than you running around trying to track down everything for them. So let's talk about decision making in terms of architecture, and this is really very specifically from a business perspective, right? If you are an IT person and you're responsible for architecture on some level, you've probably been in the situation where you've had to try to explain architectural decisions, the pros and cons to a business person. And it is challenging, and you don't really want to be in a situation where every architectural decision you make, you have to get a business person's buy-in or agreement, right? You want to be as transparent as possible, and you want to make sure that your business person, your sponsors, those key stakeholders are as informed as possible. But one thing that I really recommend from an architectural decision-making perspective is something that I refer to as guiding principles. And this idea of what are the things that we will always or never do in our data warehouse or our healthcare information environment, so that you don't have to go every time to a business person and ask for permission associated with your architectural structure, right? So, these guiding principles can be things like, we will always have an ODS, and that ODS will have data that will be held for 1 week, 7 days, something like that. And that data, after the 7 days, the data from that ODS gets moved into the audit control environment, and new data is placed into the ODS for the next set of data that you pull out of your transactional systems, that kind of a thing. So it's sort of these sweeping statements that support what would be the business intelligence guiding principles. So this idea of how do we support from a business intelligence perspective, how do we support our business users? So in this context then, it's the frequency of data. We will refresh data every week. Okay, from an IT guiding principles perspective around our healthcare information architecture, we're going to keep data in the ODS for 7 days. So you see what I'm saying there. It's there, these two guiding principles. And if you create these sort of to mirror each other, like there's a requirement, it's almost like a requirement perspective, right, from a BI perspective, and then how do you meet that requirement from an IT perspective, it will help buffer a lot of those sort of mundane architectural decisions and help your business users put a little bit of context around each of those things. But how do you really do that? And how do you get your business users to understand the implications associated with those architectural decisions? And at some point, even with those guiding principles, there are going to be architectural decisions that are much more complicated, much more in depth, that have a lot more impact to the things that are important in a data warehouse. So what I call the abilities. And we've talked about the abilities in other webinars. We've certainly reviewed those in the book. But these are the things that any good data warehouse or healthcare information environment should be able to do. It should be very reliable. It should be very flexible. It should be very scalable, repeatable, and usable. So let's talk about what each of those things are and why that's important. From a reliability perspective, of course you need your data warehouse, your healthcare information environment to be reliable. That actually has two different ways. You can think about reliability in two different ways. Reliability, a lot of people think about it in the terms of, well, if I go there, it's always there, right? It's always available. The server's not down. I can log in. That's one way of looking at reliability. Another way of looking at reliability is the data itself, right? If the data is reliable, I trust the data that's coming out of the healthcare information environment. And so how do we ensure that we're addressing both of these reliability aspects? Because I'm not talking about infrastructure today from a reliability perspective, we're going to focus more on the idea that I trust or I rely on the healthcare information environment from a reliability perspective. Flexibility. Now this is a standard architectural ability that we hear all the time. A number of years ago, as the corporate information factory was very, very popular, everybody was data marting the heck out of everything, right? You'd look at a data warehousing environment and you'd see an itty bitty little data warehouse with a nicely designed star schema and then 47 data marts. And what often happened is what was termed stovepiping, right? Because at some point or another, you had so many data marts, you started connecting the data marts together so that you'd have a nice, easy way of connecting those pieces of data together, forgetting that was the point of the enterprise data warehouse to begin with. So when you're architecting, there has to be a concept of flexibility, right? We can't just create 47 data marts because it's really easy to throw a data mart together because they're logical subject areas. We have to make sure that we have the ability to grow and be flexible with that environment over time. And then there's the scalability aspect of it. Of course, you couldn't not read an article about business intelligence or analytics today without referring to or hearing the term big data. That's definitely a webinar for another time. If you've read any of my recent articles about big data, you know how I feel about the term. at the end of the day, the concept of big data is all about scalability. It's all about our ability to pull the data in that's useful from a business user's perspective and maintain a level of performance that our business users have come to expect. And that is where we talk about scalability, and that has an awful lot to do with how you architect that data. Things like those hallways to nowhere or those 13 joins every time you have to run a member count, that impacts scalability just as much as the volume of data does, more so. Repeatability, this ability to, from an ETL architecture perspective, always do the same things over and over and over again. And that may seem like it's sort of of course, Laura, that's what you do, you repeat it. But you'd be surprised how often we're in scenarios where, or maybe you wouldn't be depending on where you work, where we are also recipients of data, right? We use a lot of data warehouse clearing or data clearing houses to grab, third-party administrator claims or just marketing databases so that we can get a better perspective of our members or our patients. So we're grabbing data as well. And so if they're pushing us a data file, but they made changes to the data file, it's very hard for us to repeat consistently what's happening because our script is based on a standard file format that they changed and didn't tell us. So there's always an aspect of repeatability that's very important from an ETL perspective, because if you can't get that ETL to turn around in a reasonable amount of time, then it impacts the reliability or the person's anticipation that that healthcare information environment is going to be available. And then we're talking about usability, which is probably the most difficult ability to address. And here it's about a business user's expectations around not only the data itself, but how that data responds. And one of the challenges that we have in data warehousing today, and particularly in healthcare, not because of the volume of data so much as the different types of data or the disparate data that we're dealing with, is that most people expect queries to return in the same speed that Google returns a series of queries that you do into Google. So I call that the Google effect, right? Everybody's used Google, and everybody knows that. This morning my son was interested in looking at the Knights in Shining Armor, and so he typed in Knights in Shining Armor in Google, and that popped back in 0.7 seconds, and it had 15 million results. That perception is really tough to deal with when we're talking about data warehousing, and that is an aspect of usability that we have to work around, and that has everything to do with how you architect that data so that we have as good of performance as possible. So these are the abilities that we try to address. These are the kinds of things that you're thinking about when you're architecting, and these are the kinds of questions that you need to ask your end users to help guide you in making some of those architectural decisions. You may not always ask a business user how you should connect two tables together, but you can ask them about their need for certain aspects associated with reliability or flexibility or scalability. So in other words, how often are you going to run this query? Do you see any future need for these types of data points? And if so, how can we structure them so that we can connect them appropriately so that we don't have to go back and sort of re-architect the whole darn thing when we get to that point at some point in the future. And we all know we can't look into a crystal ball. Healthcare has changed drastically in the last 3 to 4 years. But the point is that if you're really mindful about it and think about it in terms of these abilities, and be planful and use your business users and your business stakeholders and your executives in the best way possible, which is helping you understand what their expectations are and what the strategy of the organization is and what they're seeing in the landscape of the industry, you can get pretty darn far. So when we were just talking about the abilities, you heard me mention a number of times about sort of this idea of ETL or extract, transform, and load, and how important it was in addressing a number of these abilities. The interesting thing is when we talk about architecture for healthcare information environments, we often skip the importance of extract, transform, and load or data integration. And it is such a critical aspect of our success that it's just too bad that we don't talk more about it and think more about it, right? So I'm a big proponent of hiring an ETL architect, which is generally speaking, that person has been an ETL developer for many, many years. They understand how ETL best practices work. They have a good solid understanding of products, and they have a good understanding of the business in and of itself, the industry of healthcare and how that works, so that they can architect appropriately, to be able to support all of those abilities that we just talked about. So a number of years ago, I co-wrote an article with a good friend of mine who I consider to be probably one of the best ETL architects in the business. And we wrote an article on ETL best practices. And these are the 10 that we wrote about. And I think they make so much sense, but so often from a data integration perspective, we miss some of these or we just flat out skip them because we don't have time. And they always come back to bite us in the butt. So let's talk about these and as you're moving forward in your data warehousing journey, hopefully you think about these as you're working on your ETL part. So the first one is applying a software development lifecycle to your ETL. We almost never do that. We don't think about ETL query writing in terms of analysis and design, development, testing, and deploying, right? It's like, oh, well, I need to make this change to the data. Joe, can you go out and apply that in the data warehouse? Sure, I'll go do that. And there's no, thought process around analyzing it, what else it's gonna impact, designing the query itself, developing it, releasing it into a test. We're just, generally speaking, we're going so darn fast, we don't have time for those best practices. But if you think about it, the reason the software development lifecycle exists in the first place is to stop ourselves from making some easily avoidable mistakes. So, I recommend it. Try to be as agile as possible, do those things in a very iterative fashion, but it's a very good idea to apply a standard SDLC to ETL. The second one is the enterprise level data integration view. And this happens sort of naturally if you hire somebody to be your ETL architect or a very high level ETL developer. But this idea that you give that ETL architect exposure to the enterprise business, help them understand the industry, help them understand the market landscape that you exist in, help them understand what the business users want to see, get them exposure to the business users, let them talk to them and have those conversations. The more context you can give your ETL architect, the better job they'll be able to do when they're designing these things. Of course, data profiling and data quality exist within your ETL layer. That's the best spot for it. You can support a lot of the application of the business rules by ensuring that you, like I said earlier, you're just doing plain old record counts, right? Data profiling obviously can get way more in depth than that. But if you're applying the software development lifecycle and you're going through the analysis phase, you better darn well know what that data is that you're going to be sucking out and landing somewhere else, right? And that's where the data quality and data profiling piece comes in. And the ETL layer is the best spot to do that before you actually get it into your enterprise data warehouse. Of course, using a staging area not only protects you from making mistakes, but also gives you an opportunity to protect your transactional systems. And it's the spot where you can do a lot of the profiling and data quality application prior to putting it into the EDW. So as you may recall from the healthcare information environment, there's an ODS or a staging area. Use that for your ETL. That's a brilliant spot to be. Number 5, encourage reusable transformations. I think this is a great way to think about it. But as you're going back and thinking about your enterprise level data integration view and talking to the business about what they need and what they want, if you can think about it from a 30,000 foot view perspective for a minute, we often are reusing a lot of these data, or reusing a lot of the aspects of these data, right? So if you stop and think about how you structure your ETL, you'll find that there's a number of reusable transformations. That way you're not reinventing the wheel every time, right? So encourage that by just being really planful. Of course, data latency is always a big issue from ETL perspective, how long it takes us to get data in there. we've gone everywhere from, refreshing data every month to then it was a week, then it was a day, and then this concept of real time or zero latency data. What you want to do from an ETL perspective is meet with your business users where they want to be. Sometimes in healthcare, zero latency or for sure real-time data just doesn't make a lot of sense. The average business user is not interested in the fact that it takes a claim 11 times before it becomes a final adjudicated claim. So you want to be mindful of not only the business requirement, but what just makes sense from a data perspective, and then go from there. I love that my friend, his name's Ron Amani, who helped me write this article. He said, gracefully handling ETL errors. I think that's a really nice way to put this. It happens all the time, right? Either your source system file format changes from a data structure that you're pulling forward, or something else has just changed. Somebody made a change to the query and an error happens. I remember a number of years ago, ETL developer called me up and said, so the data didn't load because we made a change and we inadvertently dropped any data that ended with 1. That's a true story, and I think we handled that as gracefully as we could. So the idea here is you just want to make sure that when you have ETL errors, and they will occur, you create a log and you make sure that you don't duplicate those errors, right? Noisy data happens. Our data is pretty, not great when you take it out of those transactional systems, whether it be EHR or some of these other systems that are really tough. ETL errors will happen a lot. If you have an error log file, you can go back, you can try to remove those instances of noisy data as much as possible. The noisy data is a good example. Is those errors happen over and over and over and over again, and it's often a lack of process. Or when I was working years ago in PBM, we noticed that there was oftentimes you'd see 99999999999 in a field, and what we recognized from a process perspective was that when the pharmacist would lean over the window to talk to the patient about their drug, give them a little drug counseling, take this with food kind of a thing, they would lean on the 9 key. That's noisy data, right? So you gracefully handle those noisy data issues. If there's a data actual ETL error issue that happens, you put that in that log file, you do some tracing back, and you figure out how to avoid repeating those same mistakes in the future. ETL testing, I think this is very much related to the software development lifecycle, but this idea that you're always mindful about the ETL queries themselves. So as you're developing, you're applying sort of these SDLC standards, right? But we're sort of proposing that you also just do ETL testing, and that you're always looking for ways to improve your code so that things are going faster, and that you're never just sort of sitting around waiting for the next business rule, which of course nobody ever does. But testing the ETL itself, I think, is an excellent recommendation. Knowledge of ETL tools. There's not that many out there, frankly. If you want to get into the open source stuff, I suppose you could start to make that case. But for the most part, extract, transform, and load tools or data integration products, whatever you want to call them, they function very similarly. Their job is to suck data out and put it in someplace. So just a basic knowledge of how those work, and then some depth of understanding of your tool that you use in particular often helps. And then, of course, compliance requirements. We all know them, we all love them, and our ETL developers and architects have to apply all of those compliance rules. They are the ones that are in control of the data as it moves between systems. They are the ones that we will often have to ask if we do get audited, what happened, what did you do, where's the code, that kind of a thing. So anything that you can do to make sure you manage those compliance requirements as much as possible is really very much an ETL best practice. So let's talk a little bit about the right technology. And so I put question mark here, right? And I'm gonna bust a myth if you ever watch the Mythbusters TV show, and it's probably not a myth to many of you. But the fact of the matter is, most business intelligence tools most ETL products out there can do the baseline, right? There's a level of sort of a commodity technology that exists today in business intelligence and data warehousing. Most of them can do what we need them to do. It's the next step where we get hung up a little bit. So in other words, if you assume that they all are, if you're going car shopping, you're not going to go up and ask for the car that has 4 wheels, right? All of our BI ETL products at this point in our technology advancement have 4 wheels. You got to get up from there, right? You want an SUV, you want a pickup, you want a sedan, you want a convertible. You have to be specific, right? And not only specific, you have to make sure that you buy a product that makes sense for your organization and how you work. If you got a bunch of Unix developers, you're probably not going to want to go out and buy a very Windows heavy program. And the same is true for the other side of that equation. So, when you're buying technology, think about it outside of terms of the standard request for a proposal of, I want it to, burst out reports. Every BI product bursts out reports. That's not really a requirement, and it's distracting you from the actual activity that's very important to you, which may be visualizing data or having mobile considerations. So when you're thinking about these purchase cycles, think about the questions that really differentiate the BI tools and the technology or the skill set that you have to be able to support those products, right? And know, as I said earlier when we were looking at the healthcare information environment, just know that you're going to likely need more than one product to meet all of your business users' needs. But the important thing, both from an architecture perspective as well as a technology perspective, is that there are no right answers, okay? You can't call me and say, I've got this situation, what is the thing that I need to do? What is the architectural decision? What is the technology? There's shades of gray, right? There's a whole bunch of different levels of consideration that we all have to make as we make these choices and decisions. And the best thing that you can do, not only from a technology perspective, but also from an architecture perspective, is to just be mindful about that. Look at things not just from a very specific point in time perspective, but from a landscape perspective, and try to get as much context as possible. I just realized that I didn't put a contact slide at the end of my webinar. I'm very sorry. For those of you that are interested in contacting me, you can always reach me at my email, lmadsen@lancetsoftware.com. And if you're interested, you can follow me on Twitter at lbmadsen. I think we had one question here, and that question was, what is the best approach for healthcare data warehouse architecture? And I hope that this was a question that came in early on. I hope I answered that question for you. I think when we talk in terms of approach, the thing is that you just, obviously I've used the word mindful, but I think that's very important. Remember that we don't just rely on technology, but we also have to rely on process and skill level of people, and rely a lot on your business users. They're not going to be able to answer you questions about how you connect tables, but they can tell you about what they need, and frame that up in those terms from an architecture perspective. That's what you'll have to do, right? And then probably most importantly, I guess, when you're thinking about that, is to think about those abilities and making sure that you address each of those abilities as you build out your data warehouse architecture. So if I didn't answer your question, please feel free to contact me directly and we can talk a little bit more. So thank you very much for your time this afternoon. I hope it was helpful. And we'll be doing the fourth in the series of the Healthcare Business Intelligence webinars next month, and that one is on providing value. Thank you. Have a good afternoon.